I never felt adequate as a child. I was told numerous times, on separate occasions, that I was too much, too loud, too needy, too loving even. At school, I wasn't popular. I didn't have many friends. I was teased and harassed. By the time I transitioned into junior high, I had already learned to hate school life, to be wary of other kids, and to feel unworthy of love. Every day, my mom took me to school and then sat with me in the car until I stopped crying and agreed to get out. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to disappear. As the end of my first year in junior high rolled in, the school nurse took all the seventh graders in for a quick physical. That included having our height and weight measured. For the first time in years, I actually found out how much I weighed, which the nurse said was perfectly normal for my age and height, and yet I couldn't stop thinking about the number. It seemed so grown up, not a child's weight, but a woman's. Also around the same time, we started working on the big production of the year, the seventh graders' Bnei Mitzvah ceremony, a ceremony marking the rite of passage from childhood to adulthood in the Jewish tradition. The school booked one of the biggest venues in the country, hired a director, and everybody started trying out for different roles in this massive production. To my great surprise, I was picked out of an entire class of 350 to sing the show's single solo number. Rehearsals were in full swing. Soon the big night came, and I was standing in the wings, preparing to get on stage. Another girl was helping me into my costume when the zipper got stuck. It was a hand-me-down dress that the director had used in many of his productions, obviously old and worn out, but the girl still jokingly remarked, "Uh-oh, someone's been eating too much." I went out on that stage and sang my solo number in front of 2,000 audience members and 350 students, and within those 3 minutes that it took to complete the song, I was transformed. From the strange, mousy girl, the laughable weirdo, I became the school singer, the girl with the beautiful and powerful voice. For weeks later, kids would stop me in the schoolyard, asking incredulously, "Hey, you're the one with the beautiful voice, aren't you? Was that really you singing?" I was the opposite of invisible, and for the first time in years, that felt good. But that transformation was in the way others saw me, not the way I saw myself or them. It was too late for that. And all I could think about was that number on the scale and that girl's remark. I oftentimes wonder what would have happened, how the next 10 years of my life would have turned out if I had embraced the role of the singer. Instead, anorexia had already started claiming my identity. I'm Liron Cohen.
I'm Karin,
and we are changing the conversation about eating disorders.
First, I wanted to ask you about the number on the scale. Why was it so meaningful to you that this number seemed to indicate a woman's body weight?
I think that it was just the timing and the combination of all these different things that I was talking about. It was, I had gotten my period for the first time a few months before that. As I mentioned, we were working on a ceremony that symbolized our transitioning from childhood to adulthood, and it just all of a sudden seemed very real that I was not a child anymore, that I'm becoming a woman. And it was both being a woman and being an adult. Both things scared me for different and obviously some of them overlapping reasons. I think when it comes to womanhood, we can and probably should do a full podcast on that subject. But I think that if I'm talking about adulthood, there were a lot of responsibilities that scared me. I felt that as a kid, I would probably be free. As an adult, I had more of a responsibility to face a disappointment and hardship and a lot of these real life issues that scared me. And it became more and more real that I was getting there very quickly.
It sounds like as a child, you were worried about becoming an adult because it seemed to you like adulthood was associated with facing disappointment, facing hardship. And so if I'm hearing you correctly, what you said was that it wasn't about fear of fat, but it was more about fear of the the social and emotional difficulties or the practical difficulties that were awaiting you as you grew older?
Well, I think what we're trying to say throughout all of our podcast episodes is that it's not just one thing. It's a kind of the perfect storm of many different things. And that was definitely one of those things. And womanhood and femininity was another one of those things. And other issues of anxiety and existential suffering, all these things that we've been talking about for months now and will continue to talk about, they're all little pieces of the puzzle.
The theme of visibility was very prominent in your story, from the simultaneous invisibility and hypervisibility you described of being shunned and bullied at school, to the positive visibility of being recognized for your singing abilities. Do you remember how you experienced these different forms of visibility in relation to your body at the time?
I remember as a child in elementary school specifically that I often was alone at recess when everybody was in groups playing and talking. I was alone. And I felt very watched and I felt very judged. And so I felt that I wanted to make myself disappear. I didn't want people to look at me and think that I was pathetic or make fun of me or start harassing me. And so I literally tried to do that. I remember specifically several times when I actually climbed up a tree and tried to hide in its branches during recess. And so the remark from that girl about my body right before going on stage, even though it was completely not a comment made at my expense at all, it was just a joke. But to me, it was very meaningful because it was at that juncture when I was about to go on stage and become very visible in a celebrated way, but at the same time in a very exposed way. And that connection in my mind of that and my body, the external expression of me, made me feel very exposed and very vulnerable. It made me feel that my body will always betray my inner secrets and it will always put me on display. Show my vulnerabilities, show that I have desires, needs, and wants, and that it made me weak. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's when I look back at it. Of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but when I look back at it, in that moment, I kind of learned to connect my external looks and my body with the way I was perceived by others, for better or worse.
It's really interesting that you said that you felt your body would make you visible.
Yes, that separation of body and me, right? Well, I always felt of my body as the physical manifestation of me. So it wasn't entirely me. I always thought of, well, I mean, again, back in the day, I always felt that I was this spiritual, mental being that was being at the moment expressed in the physical world in a physical way. But my body was the way that I appeared to others. And so, it didn't leave me a place or a way to hide.
And how did anorexia affect your sense of visibility?
Well, visibility in anorexia is actually a paradox, right? Because on one hand, you're trying to shrink yourself up to take less room, or I tried to shrink myself up to take less room. But on the other hand, that made me stand out. That in some instances, it made me the center of attention. And even in school, I became, after I was the singer, at some point I became known as this weird girl who almost never comes to school because I was always sick or in a hospital or something. But by then, that kind of attention was different because I didn't feel anymore that I needed the other kids' approval. I had my own inner strength that came from my eating disorder, or so I felt that it was. And even though I realized that I was standing out, it was on my terms. And I had made myself feel that I didn't need or want anybody else anymore. And so I was okay with that.
It's interesting that you're saying that the visibility of anorexia occurred on your terms, or that you felt it occurred on your terms, especially thinking about what you said about wondering what might have happened had you embraced the role of the singer. So I wanted to ask, how did anorexia affect your relationship with singing, specifically with your singing voice and with your body when performing on stage?
Well, singing is another topic that we could do a whole podcast about, and I would love to do it, because singing and in music, I think a lot of people could relate to music, even if not singing specifically. But the more anorexic I became, the less in touch with my body I became. And as a result, I was less and less able to sing. I continued to get asked to perform in school and in other city functions until one day when I was, I think, 16 or 17, I performed very poorly. And so at that point, I think people understood that I wasn't going to be able to perform anymore. And the reason that I performed that poorly was because I was so disconnected from my body. And of course, my body was also weak. I had very little energy. But also because as the anorexia progressed and the depression progressed, I had developed the belief that singing, as well as laughing, talking too loudly, and just listening to music, were all kind of making myself the center of attention and were things that I didn't deserve. And I started punishing myself by not letting myself do those things. So to the point where I wasn't allowed to listen to music for a long time. And so as I became more and more disconnected from my body, and my relationship with my body was based in hate and denial, of course, I was less and less able to sing, but I also felt that I didn't deserve to sing anymore. So it was all part of, I didn't deserve to rest, eat, feel good, be happy, sing, etc.
Given that denial of singing was a form of mortifying yourself, do you feel that singing played a positive role in your recovery?
Singing played a very important role in my recovery, and my singing teacher actually played a very big role in helping me get there. And it's, again, a very big topic that maybe we'll get to talk about some other time, but I will just say that I remember the day, because I had been working with my singing teacher on a song, and I kept singing from my mouth, from my throat, not from where I was supposed to sing, which is the diaphragm, and from my whole body, essentially. And we worked so hard on trying to get me to open my mouth, which was something that I just wasn't doing. I was keeping it very, very small, and breathing and getting in touch with my body. And one day, and she told me to try to sing from my feet so that I could ground myself. And I remember one day at home, I was practicing, and I finally got it. I managed to do it, and it felt so good. And I remember in that moment, and it didn't matter that I had a long road ahead of me after that, but I remember in that moment thinking, how could I ever treat my body badly when it can give me so much joy, like singing? And I think that was a very important moment that really helped me in my recovery, even though, again, I had a long road after that, but at least I had that to keep in mind to help me.
As your story shows, when we're thinking about how eating disorder identities begin, it's really important to consider what triggers an eating disorder and how that trigger might be related to a deeper cause or meaning that's connected to the way that people see themselves and the way that they perceive their place in the world. And this is something that I'm going to discuss now in my story. When I conducted my doctoral fieldwork in Israel more than a decade ago, I began each first interview by asking the participant, when and how did it begin? While the question established a uniform beginning for all narratives, the interpretation of when and how was intensely individual and highly variable. Most participants narrated the beginnings of their eating disorders as fraught with ambiguity, their starting points nonspecific or multiple. Yet most participants also spoke of at least one triggering event that marked the beginning of their eating disorder. In most cases, the participants recognized triggering events as such only months or years after they occurred. But once identified, triggering events became crucial to the process of meaning making. Triggers, however, were distinct from causes. They were bounded experiential and narrative events, not underlying motivations. Of course, weight-related triggers were common, but these triggering events were powerful not because of their connection to eating, but because they channeled conflicts towards the body. And often, the triggers that instigated eating disorders bore no direct relation to food or weight. As the participants' discussions of triggering events revealed, the beginnings of eating disorders could be traced to a sense of vulnerability and social difference. Some participants related their sense of difference to their minority status, to queer identity, to working classness, to being labeled obese as a child, to minority ethnic or migrant backgrounds, and to the bullying and microaggressions they endured. In many cases, however, this sense of difference was not directly related to social categories. Participants often described a fundamental lack of belonging, which set them apart from society in a profound, sometimes unbridgeable way, a difference whereby the self was not only distinct, but also alienated. Some participants attempted to ground this difference in personal characteristics, implicating obsessiveness, perfectionism, and self-discipline, as well as sensitivity, anxiety, and addictive tendencies. Still, for most participants, the sense of social difference that underlay the beginnings of their eating disorder remained both invisible and ineffable.
So it sounds like, from what you're describing in your story, that the search for a new identity is instigated by the social rejection of the original identity. Was that your observation?
When participants spoke about the importance of their eating disorder identity, they didn't always say that it involved a negation of a previous identity. For the most part, identities before eating disorders began were spoken about in terms of feeling rejected and misunderstood, being bullied and ostracized, feeling invisible. Some participants also described feeling ashamed in themselves or in certain aspects of themselves, or feeling that they did not live up to social or personal expectations. So identity wasn't always spoken about explicitly, but defining oneself socially and otherwise was a central preoccupation.
Identity oftentimes leads to a community around that identity. How much do you feel that, how much of a role did the community play in the need for that identity, or was it experienced in solitary to the same effect?
So, first of all, individual identity, as we all know, is always bound up with other people. But in the case of eating disorders, this is also an identity that often requires other people, that is, healthcare professionals, to acknowledge and confer it. So, in participants' narratives of their eating disorder identity, acknowledgement from other people, such as healthcare professionals, but also parents, other relatives, and friends, was really important. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they experienced this identity as part of the community. Some did. Some participants sought friendships with other people who had eating disorders. Some participants were exposed to eating disordered communities online or in treatment centers and came to value these communities and to value being part of these communities, but not everyone did. Some participants actively set themselves apart from other people with eating disorders and told me that they were not interested in pursuing these friendships. But at the same time, there was a sense of belonging to a diagnostic category or to a defined patient group.
And through your years of research and your follow-up interviews, did you get a first-hand look at the evolution of a participant's identity along the process of recovery?
Some participants told me that part of the reason they were afraid of recovering was that they could not imagine what other identity could replace their identity of having an eating disorder, and this feeling of dreading the void that awaited, this feeling of dreading having to reinvent oneself, was what was holding them back from recovering. So issues of identity were central to recovery. But in terms of witnessing an evolution in identity, I think the word evolution might not be the best word to describe this process. What I did observe through follow-up interviews was how people's ways of speaking about their identities changed over time. So it wasn't necessarily a linear process where a new identity developed over time to replace the old eating disorder identity. It was more a process in which people redefined or gave new meaning to their eating disorder identities. Even if they no longer identified as eating disordered, people did speak about integrating their previous identity as having had an eating disorder into their current identity, and of this process as being quite a healthy way of bridging past and present, and of creating a continuity in their autobiography and in their way of understanding themselves and relating to their bodies in the present tense.
Well, there is so much that we can talk about when it comes to identity, and in fact, we are planning to do that. This is just the first of a series of episodes. This is just kind of the introductory episode. We're going to have a whole series of episodes about identity and eating disorders, which we will be weaving throughout with other episodes. And we would like to thank Martina Valente from Amsterdam, whose email to us inspired us to talk about this subject and to actually do the whole series. And we welcome all of your comments and requests and ideas. And on that note, we will invite you to join us next month for our first podcast featuring a guest, Dr. Rachel Bachner-Melman. And we will talk about the connection between eating disorders and altruism. We hope you join us.
Thank you for joining us in Changing the Conversation. Feel free to email us at any time with comments, questions, or anything else to changetheconvoed@gmail.com.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media, where we also have links to other resources and further reading. Look for Changing the Conversation About Eating Disorders on Facebook and at ChangeConvoED on Twitter.
We hope you join us again for our next episode on the first Tuesday of next month.